we have been very light on the introduction to Jacqueline Novogratz because she doesn't need one. If you don't know who she is, get onto the Google machine and it'll tell you who she is. And we're going to work on the assumption that her many decades of contribution to the space speak for themselves, and we're going to spend this time trying to tease out some of the kind of reflections and lessons from that. So I'm going to start by asking you a kind of macro question, which is going to be the only, what I hope will be the only sort of slightly scary and depressing question that we will spend time on today, which is, what is keeping you up at night right now that makes you existentially concerned as a backdrop to what we're going to try and solve for the rest of the time we're together?
Existentially. Thanks, Paul, and just thanks for this opportunity. Just looking around this room and seeing so many friends, teachers, partners is really exciting, and look forward to a conversation. I actually think we are facing four existential automata that are no surprise to anyone. Climate catastrophe, inequality that has gotten to unsustainable levels, and connected to that is a growing divisiveness across all nations and sectors increasingly. And then the lack of consensus around what truth is, which is very frightening, and I think it's very much connected to the complacency we're seeing in our political leaders, who we seem to trust less and less for good reason.
So that's a good, I worked for a truth commission in my prior life, and Michael Ignatieff had this wonderful quip. He said, truth commissions never reveal the truth. All they do is narrow the range of permissible lies. And I think one of the challenges we have right now in the world is narrowing the range of permissible lies. Climate change is not occurring, inequality doesn't exist, everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And in a world where everybody is in their own little echo chamber, bursting through and getting clarity and consensus on some of the big challenges is increasingly politically difficult. So that divisiveness and that partisanship and the dissolution of truth are real challenges for our field. And so I sort of want to ask you, when you look at that backdrop, the sorts of things that you are embarking on that give you hope, that you're investing your time in, what are the sort of macro things that you are doing that are seeking to address those problems?
What sounds like there were a couple of questions embedded in that. Starting just with the macro is, we look at four big problems. One is energy, healthcare, education, and agriculture for the poor. Everything we do is focused on solving big problems of poverty. What gives me hope? And I think it's a benefit of actually doing this work for so many years, 35 years and counting, which is kind of shocking to me, but is that I've seen the needle move because a few social entrepreneurs have the moral imagination to see an enormous problem and take a step towards solving it. And over time, more players start to build on their knowledge, start to build on the business models that they create. And it feels like before you know it, but it might be 15 years. 800 million people have access to electricity that didn't, for instance. And we start to think what was impossible becomes possible. And I actually think we have that in a few domains today in the world.
So you described, and when we were talking before, a sort of journey that you've been on for how you saw problems and sought to solve them in the early days, and how that has evolved to what you're doing now. And I think that account will be interesting for people because you do have that kind of decade span of how the field has evolved. I mean, you've been central to the field of impact investing and social entrepreneurship, and Acumen has been at the heart of incubating both the ideas and some of the most successful entrepreneurial endeavors and companies. So take us on that journey a little bit, because I think that little potted history is interesting for people in the room.
Sure, and maybe I'll take it through one investment in one sector. When we started 21 years ago, we had one big idea, which was patient capital, that the world was bifurcated, certainly when it came to capital, between philanthropy and investment, seeking to maximize returns, that there was this middle space. That if we took philanthropy and rather than give it away, invest it for the long term, which gets longer all the time, as we really understand what it takes to build new industries, but let's say 15 years. And we accompany those entrepreneurs, giving them access not just to our financial resources, but to our social networks, connections, et cetera, that maybe we could really solve problems of poverty. Back in 2001, that idea was considered not just radical, but silly. And I was constantly told that I didn't understand how business operated, obviously. And the field has obviously changed dramatically. In 2007, 6 years after, two co-eds came into our office with a $30 solar light and a vision to eradicate kerosene, which was being used by 1.5 billion people in the world for their energy source. Expensive, polluting, dangerous. And we took a bet, patient capital, $250,000, really having no idea what we were getting ourselves into, nor did they. But what they did have, what we call that moral imagination. They had the audacity to think they could solve this huge problem and the humility to immerse, to get close to the people that they wanted to serve. We had no understanding that it wasn't not just a fact that people made no money, $1, $2, $3 a day, but they had no trust of this newfangled technology. Though it costs $30, if you make $2 a day, you do not have $30 in your pocket, and you have a 50 cents a day practice to buy your kerosene. And if you don't have the money, you don't have energy for that day. We had no understanding of what the status quo really was, that there were big kerosene and diesel mafias. And I would say it took 10 years of that patient investing, allowing them to try and fail and try again, play hardball, listen to their customers until they had a real business model. Once they were 30, 40, actually they were at about $50 million revenues, and we had invested across this now emerging ecosystem, we assumed that the impact investors would want to help scale these companies. Truth is, even at that level, Paul, there weren't a lot of takers. Because while these companies were profitable, they hadn't seen a lot of exits. And so we decided at that point to create our first for-profit, much more traditional impact fund, Cowie Safi, a $70 million fund, to start taking those companies to scale. Today, we've invested about $40 million, a mix of the philanthropic patient capital and then the for-profit impact capital, and have reached about 160 million people with off-grid solar. That represents more than 30% of all customers on the planet who have gotten access to off-grid solar since 2007, which is a really good news story. It also gives us the confidence to say, all right, there's 800 million people left who still have no electricity. We as a world have said that SDG 7 which is universal electrification, is a valuable goal and one we can achieve. However, we will not achieve it if we don't take into consideration the 215 million people who we deem hardest to reach, truly off the grid. They live in 23 sub-Saharan African countries who have at most a 45% electrification rate. Some are in countries like Guinea with a 9% electrification rate. And so think of those four automata. We kid ourselves if we think that all of these problems are not interdependent, whether it's refugees or climate crises or international development or war. You cannot build a country when 81% of your people with an average age of 19 have no access to electricity. And so we've moved, Paul, from saying we have a big idea to we can actually solve a really wicked problem. But it will not be with business as usual. We need to get more sophisticated in the way we think about capital. And my critique of the impact investing sector is too much of it still goes to where capital and returns are easiest rather than to where the capital is most needed. It is desperately needed in these 23 African sub-Saharan countries hard. So how do you then structure a facility that is unapologetic about where philanthropy is needed to create markets that have never existed, which we know is a really important thing for patient capital to do? And then where is concessionary debt needed to allow private sector companies like D-Lights and others that have proven they can do this to actually go to where their shareholders have no interest in going because they've worked for 15 years to build a profitable company. And Benin, Burkina, and Somalia are not looking like great next steps. And yet the world needs it. So how do we solve that problem rather than start with the impact investing to solve the problem of how do I do good and maximize my returns? And that is the new frontier, and that is what fully energizes me for the next 20 years.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different ways that we can deploy capital to try and achieve impact. You started off by saying there was an old, business is one thing, philanthropy is another thing. Patient capital comes in, which is there may be a slightly different approach to how we allocate capital for purpose. We rushed through to the current day where everybody's saying you don't really need to trade these things off. You can have an impact unicorn. You can read Larry Fink's letter who says the next 1,000 unicorns are all going to be in the climate space, which on one level is incredibly encouraging, right? That's a good thing. But what it may do is unwittingly perpetuate the idea that every problem that we have that is deep and structural and trying to get to the bottom of the pyramid is something for which there is a market plus return capital solution. And so where are we going to be designing all those blended forms of capital? Like, where is that happening? Because on one level, you could say the concessionary capital that comes in to create markets and solve these problems can sometimes feel like a bit of a chump because it creates the space that other people get rich off, and that sort of feels as though that doesn't feel right. If you're going to get rich off that, then you should be in that space. But then you have a kind of agency problem because how do you get the people there to agree to do that when they're saying, no, we want markets to be able to seek impact and returns, but they want to be market returns because then we get more capital. So it's a devilish problem, and I think we understand it, but where is that being solved? I suspect in your head, but how are we going to address this as a kind of genuine conundrum? We see it all the time here at the Conduit.
Yeah, no, even on a micro level, one of my favorite internal stories is with one of our co-investors where we've both been in this company for a long time. The company went into trouble, but we still really believed that it could succeed, but it needed a bridge round. And the co-investor calls me and says, Acumen should do the whole thing. And I said, well, you're a co-investor. It's going to send a very funny signal to the market if only one of us actually does the bridge. And he said, Jacqueline, you get on all these stages and you talk about love. And then when it comes right down to it, you're just as bad as anybody else. And I was like, look, our capital is patient. It is not stupid. And I was like, you're either in or we don't play. And of course, we both did it. But it was exactly that conundrum. You're the nonprofit. Rather than how do we structure this capital so that we give the company the best chance to ultimately raise the kind of capital it needs to succeed? Because at the end of the day, we're both trying, supposedly, hopefully, trying to solve the same problem. And so it's that switch. Here's where I would also say, Paul, we have to make a plea for nuance. This room is filled with some of the smartest human beings on the planet. Most of us went to really great universities, but our universities fail to teach us to embrace nuance, to hold opposing values in tension. And we somehow buy in as we get professional, and we could blame the system, we can blame, I was just with an investment banker, and he's like, it's not our fault, it's the monster in which we operate. It's like, but aren't we the monster? Where do we find that moral courage to recognize that every day, 1,000 decisions that we're making all have trade-offs, whether we're a parent or a teacher, a consumer. And so, of course, that's going to be the way that we have to think about how we make decisions as impact investors. And the question is, what trade-off are you willing to make? For what? When D-Light was first trying to figure out how do you price a product when you have no competition, when your customers make $2 or $3 a day, where your goal is to maximize adoption and long-term make a profit. How do you price that? We all, the two co-founders and I all went to Stanford Business School, and when they asked me, I just kind of was like, it's a really good question. How do you price it? And ultimately, you can go back to the shareholder value, consumer value, but ultimately, we wanted a successful company long term, but we had to understand at a really granular level what were the practices already being used. 50 cents a day. That was the practice. We had no financing. 50 cents a day became the baseline. With 50 cents a day, how long would it take to pay for a $30 unit? And that became a new way of thinking about price. We weren't taught that in business school.
So when it comes to the price question, because we've had both live and on a podcast the founder of Allbirds. I happen to be a big fan of Allbirds. I think it's an awesome company. It's doing extraordinarily well. Carbon zero shoes. They have stores all over the world, here in Covent Garden. They're expensive shoes. They're not going to be the shoes for the people at the bottom of the pyramid. But so they have resolved the price carbon zero question by going for a particular niche in the market, little segment of the market, that is going to be profitable and be able to deal with their impact and their carbon goals and get to net zero as a product. It's not so easy to develop a shoe product that deals with shoelessness for people who walk around without shoes in earning less than $1 a day or 25 cents a day, and to come up with an investable shoewear company that services that market. And so that's going to require almost an entirely different business model, an entirely different pricing structure, and it's going to require an entirely different set of investors.
And partners.
Right.
And partners.
Right. So when you're sitting down and evaluating who you want to allocate your precious capital to, and you have a visionary founder and a CEO who says, I'm going to achieve this gross margin and this returns, but I'm going to be able to do only ethical sourcing in my supply chain and only pay living wages and only work in net zero buildings, and all of those things are squared. Those are very, very, very rare things to be able to find. But you have a fund, you have to produce returns on that fund. You've said, I've got one fund that's my profit fund, and I've got other stuff that does this. But how do you evaluate as an investor those trade-offs? Because they're real and they're hard.
Evaluate the entrepreneur or evaluate the trade-offs?
Evaluate the business plan, which the trade-offs are sitting there right in front of you.
Well, first we divide by half or divide by 2 all of their projections. And so we just try to make it a little bit more real. The second thing is, again, I will often say that moral leadership is not the path of purity. Does the business plan, and more as importantly, does the entrepreneur understand the trade-offs that she is making? We do have a company, Paul, that pays a living wage using regenerative ag techniques with smallholder farmers in the coffee industry. And it's in the premium part of the coffee industry. It's not in the general coffee industry. We've invested, it's Azahar, we think it's a beautiful company. More important, we think it's a really powerful narrative for how you can actually build a more inclusive and more sustainable supply chain. And in that case, over time, its buyers, again, they're not the Starbucks yet, it's the Stumptowns and the Revolution Coffee, the $100 million buyers, are choosing to pay a living wage. they are offered a minimum wage. And 30% are choosing the higher level. Those stories are really important. So a cynic would say, well, great, you're building a coffee company for a premium coffee, a premium coffee buyer who sells to rich millennials. But the point is, you got to start somewhere. And we hold Azahar to account for what it says it will do, and frankly, they hold us to account. And now we're working with them using grant money, not investment dollars, to enable them to take a, right now, very complicated sustainable buyer's guide, but their way of bringing real transparency down to the micro level so that a buyer can see at a micro level how much it costs the farmers to produce. It's coffee compared to the global commodities prices. So they are no longer beholden to the price that's determined because of Brazil's bumper crop, but actually will understand that price. If we can take that sustainable buyer's guide and use our networks and our partnerships to help move that out and let other companies use it, then Azahar, which starts in one side of the market, will have impact across a growing percentage of that market.
So if there's a thing that is wildly present in the Conduit and gives me a lot of hope, it's sort of the idea of entrepreneurs who are trying to set up businesses that solve deep problems. Conduit Connect, I thought Eva's in the room, Wave, has helped get Conduit members to invest several tens of millions of pounds in startup businesses that are doing good and doing well. And you've watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those entrepreneurs. And there are many of them who are in this room. So what do you look for most in an entrepreneur who has an idea and an incipient business, but has a long, painful, hard, difficult journey ahead of them that you're going to need to back? What qualities are you looking for most?
So it starts with this phrase I keep using, the moral imagination, that they've got the idealism, the audacity to imagine the world that they want to build. But so do they have the humility, the realism to recognize the world that actually is. The next piece is that while they may have empathy, they're willing to immerse this. The American civil rights leader Bryan Stevenson would say, to get proximate to the people they want to serve. I have many nightmares of early days Acumen when MIT engineers would come to me literally and be like, I have a water technology that will purify water and will save the world, and you need to invest in it. And I'd say, well, have you ever been to the developing world? No, but this thing, turns sludge water into pure water for a couple of cents at a time. And it was clear it would be a failure. Unless you have gone, you understand the people that you are there to serve. You see them not as passive recipients waiting for some charity, but as people who want to be customers, you will fail. So moral imagination. 2, have they failed? Do they have the resiliency, the grit, the courage to keep trying, to fail, to get up and try again? And if they have no stories of failures in their lives, hard to take a bet on them because, man, they're going to have a lot of them going forward. 3, do they have the self-awareness to build a team of people who are smarter at what they do than they themselves are? And at the beginning, of course, you have to be pretty good at a lot of different things, a generalist. But we learn a lot about the entrepreneur by talking to their team members. And if the team members better understand how the business works, not just the entrepreneur. And then finally, do they not just have vision and charisma, because it's really easy to be seduced by charismatic entrepreneurs, but do they, or are they partnered with someone who has an operational understanding, a business plan that we actually believe could work and could scale? We used to say, if we can't see a path to 1 million people served, we're not going to invest. We define scale slightly differently now, but we better be able to see that pathway, even if it might look a little winding.
So you've spent a lot of your career kind of planting a flag ahead of a crowd and then waiting for the crowd to kind of get to that flag. I think we now are in a world where every major company has a chief sustainability officer, everybody writes an impact report, everybody talks about ESG. In fact, we're in a world where people are being sued for making over-promising on ESG claims, which in some ways is a kind of sign of progress, right? Because people are
It's a big sign of progress.
It's a huge sign of progress. So can you do a little bit of kind of, you planted a flag, people come to the flag, it presents another set of problems. But what's the flag that you're currently planting? Where should people be genuinely going? What do you think the next frontier is that we need to be moving from, given the enormous progress, although flawed, that we've made?
So let me actually plant two flags. One that's dominated by the head and one that's dominated by the heart. Because I actually think that the biggest flag we need is this merging of our heads and our hearts in ways that maybe we haven't had enough courage to do as a society historically. The head, I've already made reference to, Paul, which is making a plea for nuance in ways that look for the right kind of capital invested in the right kind of character to solve the right kind of problem, and move away from this impact investing as a blunt instrument. And if you look at the work that you, Choi, who's here somewhere, raise your hand, you, in case anyone wants to talk to you, is doing on Hardest to Reach. We are already working with a group of partners, some of whom are philanthropists who are willing to put significant philanthropy to help build markets. We are working with groups like the Green Climate Fund, which is a big climate DFI based in Korea, which is looking at guarantees, first loss capital, more traditional financial institutions that are talking to us about concessionary debt. All of this is needed if we're going to solve that problem. That is the next frontier, to get away from a bifurcated conversation towards a blended capital that has the rigor to actually hold itself accountable, rather than blended capital that just makes excuses for itself. That's the head. The heart is that we need to move from a framework that defines success, and I would say we've all been raised with that, as money, power, and fame. And that even though we create these funds, I was with a hedge fund guy yesterday, and he was like, I have this ESG fund. People were so excited, I thought, to invest in it. But at the end of the day, Jacqueline, now they feel like I'm wasting their precious money on the metrics to show them the impact that we have, because they really don't care about it. They want 20% returns. And this is a traditional hedge fund guy. And we got to get away from that. We got to start finding ways to define success based on the amount of human energy we release in the world, not just the profit that we make. And we need to create a framework that doesn't just put our profit and our individualism at the center, but that has the moral courage to put our shared humanity in the earth there. That will require a different set of business models, frameworks, entrepreneurs that we celebrate, other than the entrepreneurs who are amazing, but are self-defined by how rich they are. I'm really hopeful. I just met with Robert, who just graduated from LSE. Stephen Chambers has an amazing course. I am meeting a new generation. That's where they want to live. We have to do more to name them, to celebrate them, and to share good news instead of just focusing on, yeah, but it doesn't really work. Yeah, but it's too small. This is where the world, my mentor used to say, and he borrowed it from Martin Luther King, he'd say, Jacqueline, sometimes you have to push the inevitable. This has to be our inevitable, or we are not going to succeed as a world.
So you often, I'm sure through Acumen, you sort of sit in this, you kind of have a finger in the wind, and you're seeing kind of trends that come across in the impact space. And I think it's useful for people to be able to say, where are you seeing the most fertile activity? Are there in industries, in the categories of companies, are there investment impact outcomes where you're just seeing an incredible abundance of fertility and ideas? Are you picking that up? I mean, we did this big conference with the New York Times the other day, and we had a panel on the just green transition in Africa. And we thought, well, let's try and ferret out a couple of African companies which are kind of doing net zero at the bottom of the pyramid, serving the poorest. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens. It was like incredibly inspiring to see completely kick-ass entrepreneurs working in the sector, in Namibian seaweed farmers, women CEOs doing incredible stuff. So where are you seeing things that you think are giving you hope, where there's real fertility in the space?
Well, me personally, I'm seeing it everywhere. You mentioned it around alternative energy, food systems. Food systems is so ripe, and not just looking at new kinds of foods, but I was just in India where I got to visit a company called S4S, which recognizes that we lose 40% of the food that we produce. The farmers lose 40% before it actually gets to market, and then we in the rich world throw 40% of it from our plates. And so how do you solve that problem from the farmer's perspective? And this group of students started with the technical engineering side of it, and they built solar dryers to reduce the moisture in crops like onions and tomatoes by 85%, so that the crops would last for a year, not 8 days, so that it could be easily transported because your weight was so low. And it turns out that this dehydrated food has equal flavor and can be used for cooking curries and pretty much anything that you want to cook with it. And it's already working with a couple million farmers, all of whom are women. They only go through using women's networks of smallholder farmers. And I met some of the poorest farmers who have already doubled their income. It's a company that's valued at $20 million now, and I truly believe this one could be a unicorn, working with the poorest farmers, building a relatively new market, drying commodity crops and adding real value at the local level using local technologies. I didn't used to see a lot of companies like this, Paul, and now I'm starting to see them across food, across agriculture, across energy, across education, absolutely across healthcare, and across the arts, which is also a part of, as an 8-year-old reminded me, what it means to be human, and we could do more there to integrate it all.
One of the things that we see a lot is there's certain sectors, like climate tech, has become hot, and it's pretty capital light. It's innovation heavy. You don't necessarily need massive teams, and if it works, AI algorithms to be able to early detect fires or hurricanes, wildly valuable to insurance companies, highly responsive to the needs of the world, valuable as a service, but not necessarily serving
The poor.
But not dissing climate tech at all. These
No.
It's really so. I suspect it's embedded in your last answer, but are you seeing in the ecosystem of impact companies seeking capital a good blend of companies that are investable, that are also doing sort of more delivery of basic services to the bottom of the pyramid that are in fact being investable, because they probably, if we're honest, don't have hyper returns associated with them, solid, respectable returns, but the more fashionable companies are the ones that are going to be attracting more of the kind of true venture capital. So how do you
I'm
reconcile
seeing
that?
the innovation
Yeah.
and the desire. I am not seeing the capital.
That's interesting.
And again, if you just look on a company by company basis, you can understand it, maybe. But if we think about it from an overall cost perspective, from an overall society perspective, it's impossible to understand. So you look at a country like Pakistan with over 200 million people. Right now, 30 million people are displaced, homeless. A third of the country is underwater from floods that are completely connected to climate crisis in a nation that has contributed less than 3% of emissions to our overall emissions, despite the fact that it's one of the largest economies. And so it makes no sense. They've already lost $10 billion in value. And so for us to say, well, we'd never invest there for the poor is lunacy if you take a larger scale vision. And so yes, the innovation is there. It's where, going back to one of your previous questions, we stand for patient capital. We stand for taking philanthropy and take these long-term risks. I've always been an impatient person, but now I also think we need seriously impatient capital. In this India trip, I saw 4 companies that could easily be $100 million companies, and 2 of which I think could truly have billion-dollar valuations at some point. That's almost less the point than the fact that these are so transformational. And they still do $5 million rounds. They should be doing a $100 million round each. There are no investors that are willing to take that kind of risk, despite the fact that these entrepreneurs have to be so good in the way that they are building. And that's what's missing.
I'm now going to turn it over to you because I don't want to hog Jacqueline, and we also have a limited amount of time. So there's a hand.
Hello. Hi, Jacqueline. Really nice see you hear you live. I started my career in Ashoka, finding social entrepreneurs in India and Bangladesh. And over the 3 years, I think one of the things that we saw while sitting at a coffee table, it's like, guys, we don't find much social entrepreneurs in law and justice and journalism in that field. And India is tipping its head around democracy right now. Finding entrepreneurs working in those 2 areas are becoming more and more difficult. How's Acumen's take on these kind of problems that doesn't have a market return usually? Criminal justice system, legal aid, and also like investigative journalism that does not have a market component as much. So where does the blended capital kind of Acumen's take comes in these 2 areas when there is not so much reliance on market solution? Yeah.
Thank you for that question, and you just brought me back to actually 9/11, believe it or not. But after 9/11, we made the decision to work in Pakistan and Egypt, and we were specifically looking at civil society organizations as a way we would contribute. And I was fascinated with the journalists because it was the first time I started to understand that in countries like Pakistan and Egypt at the time, there was real power in journalists that reported on human rights abuses and brought it to the international level, and then it had real impact at the local level. And so I thought we should invest in some of the newspapers, and they were just hemorrhaging cash. There was just no investment model really for them, and so we didn't. But now, in addition to the investing work we do, we have something called Acumen Academy, which is our aspiration to build the world school for social change, where we can take the lessons that we learn, identify this next generation of extraordinary social entrepreneurs in the private sector, in the for-profit sector, and in the nonprofit sector. Ensure that they represent diversity in their nations, and then obviously globally, so that in 25 years, taking that same patient approach, the leaders of the nation will include a lot of these individuals who've done the work to know their countries, to learn how to have difficult conversations across lines of difference and build the kinds of alliances that they need. There are a number of mostly nonprofit, but a few for-profit social entrepreneurs in the areas of investigative journalism, and in building cohorts of solutions-oriented journalists. And they increasingly are so brave. And so we've actually set up something called Acumen Angels, where we will, we've only done it twice, but where we'll give $20,000, $50,000 grants to either a for-profit or a nonprofit if we can see a path to scale. And I'm thinking of a woman in India, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of her company, named Disha, but her co-CEO is a woman from a very low caste. And they are building journalistic talents and identifying them across the nation from a grassroots perspective. It's an extraordinary effort. And there's a guy named Ian Lee Yi in Malaysia who also has built a platform for investigative journalists that's really making change. But I don't think it is, in either case, is a private model. But that's where we have to have this nuanced approach to capital as a tool. Capitalism is a powerful tool. But if we see it only as capitalism is using the market for everything, and then I use my philanthropy for everything else, I think we miss the opportunity to move toward wholeness. And so those of us who have capital, to look at where we can put it to make it the most effective and the highest leverage. Sometimes it'll be in a for-profit entity, and sometimes it'll be in a nonprofit. Increasingly, and in at least one of these examples, it's in a hybrid, where there's a private enterprise and a nonprofit side by side. I know Kevin Gundle's here, and he and his wife do a lot in disability. You have a lot of the same issues. But can we help the entrepreneurs, accompany them to see where the market might work, where the market fails, and where partnership either with government or philanthropy could actually help them solve that problem. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned that capital tends to bifurcate between either just caring about returns or effectively philanthropy, where there's not going to be a return of capital, much less return on capital. So I guess the question would be, since you spoke about the middle, what offerings does Acumen have, or have you seen from others, that are in fact in the middle, where the investor is willing to forgo 20% private equity returns, but does need some sort of return over the lifetime of the investment and some sort of cash flow? And do you think that such investments are realistic in some of these early stage companies, maybe getting to stage 2? Yeah, and if so, what is the pathway to get invested in those companies?
So we are about to, soon, I don't know exactly when, to launch our patient capital report. We looked at 21 years of, or 15 years, our first 15 years. So it actually isn't building in the highest part of our learning curve to be as honest as we could and take into consideration those first years where we made a ton of mistakes. And be honest about that too. But that we looked at $100 million invested in patient capital. And that 100 million has impacted about 400 million individuals, and has brought back to Acumen about somewhere between 86 and 88%. So 12 cents on the dollar has been used as philanthropy to help build these companies that have sustainably impacted 400 million people. Many of them are profitable and sustainable. We think that's a pretty good return on your philanthropic dollar. And the argument we're making there is that there's a real space between market returns and zero. And we, as philanthropists especially, should get comfortable with that space. Second good news, and I see Leslie Lobrito here, who's one of the Acumen team members at the time, who put together a $90 million concessionary debt fund with 16 different institutions during COVID crisis to enable off-grid solar companies to stay alive during COVID. And what was amazing including big institutions like CDC, Green Climate Fund again, more traditional investors be willing to look at 1-2% returns and significant risk to make loans to companies so that they could survive and we wouldn't lose some of the 400,000 jobs that have been created. So I am starting to see, interestingly, in some philanthropists and in some of the bigger institutions, we need to see a lot more of it, but a willingness to, we could say forego financial returns, but I would say gain significant social and impact returns for the capital that they are investing. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thank you so much for this. I have watched you for so long continue to meet with those hedge fund managers and those mainstream institutional investors and private investors and talk consistently about the need for them to shift their mindsets. What has worked? What has worked to really help people shift their mindsets? And I know for some people it's an utter fail. You walk away and they just don't get it. But for some, you have brought so many people into shifting their mindsets around the use of capital. And I'm not talking about the philanthropic, but really the investment capital. What can you share for us that has worked to really shift people's mindsets?
Well, first of all, I think all of us yearn to be good. I really believe that. And I think the first thing that works is to recognize that the people that are sitting across the table have a lot of the skills that the world needs. And so, and in fact, one of the skills we talk about in teaching moral leadership is that we tend to have too many conversations in an either-or way, assuming who the other side is, rather than starting with where there's common ground. We believe in a lot of the same things. We believe in the power of markets. We believe in the power of entrepreneurs, in the power of individuals to make outsized change. And so what has worked is to start with where there is common ground and to show the examples. Sometimes then you hit a turn in the road where they'll be like, well, if your ambulance company has brought 50 million people to hospital and you have a positive return from it, why aren't you a for-profit? And so then you have to get into the complicated explanation of what it actually took for you to take it. And the people who are more ideological will say, well, obviously, then you're not a good investor. It's like, well, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it as like, this was a completely broken system, and now it's a system on its way to being fully fixed because of this approach. And Suzanne, I would say the lesson that I've learned is that if I'm then in an ideological ping pong match, it might be better to wait for another day to continue that conversation. Increasingly, I'm finding myself sitting across from very curious people. And even more increasingly, and some of the hedge fund guys in this room could like back me up here, their investors are asking them what are they doing for impact. Their investors' children definitely are asking them, what are you doing, mom and dad, to invest in impact? And so increasingly, where I used to be knocking on doors and sometimes being listened to and often not, now people are inviting us in, can you talk to our teams? I actually think that all of us have a real opportunity to lead right now from this expectation that we all see the problems in the world. We might see different ways of solving those problems. Going back to the first question you asked, the icebreaker. But underneath business, social enterprise, these grassroots ways of making change could be the moral revolution. I really think we have a chance to all be part of it. We got to get away from us and them. I don't want to work with government. They're all corrupt. Not true. I don't want to work with private sector. They only care about money. Absolutely not true. Nonprofit people are woolly-headed idealists that can't get anything done. Not true. How do we break those stereotypes that actually get in our way and aren't allowing us to solve the problems that are so critical to be solved. And what's so frustrating to me is that they can be solved. We know how to solve them. We have the technologies. God knows we have the money. We have to have that moral imagination and that will to do better in the way that we build our solutions together.
So I want to do a little shout out to you as by way of sort of closing, because I think one of the reasons we set up the Conduit was inspired by the work that you had done, which is exactly the last point you just made, that every one of the world's greatest problems is solvable by a combination of ingenuity, entrepreneurship, resourcing. All of those resourcing can occur in wildly different ways. High profit seeking, totally philanthropic, blended. Every one of the problems is amenable to a solution with technology, with innovation, with community. And I think one of the things that you've done consistently is persuade us that with a focus on the problem, all the rest of that flows. With a moral inclination to solving the problem, the capital, the entrepreneurship, the ecosystem, those things flow if you're very clear that these problems are urgent and require solving. So for that, I think there are dozens of people in this room who are grateful to you, your thinking, whose careers have been shaped. This institution has been shaped, and we're so grateful, and we'll keep asking you back if you keep coming.
Paul, I'd love to keep coming back, but can I say one word you didn't say, which you are singularly leading the pack on, which is community. I don't think we talk enough about community, and in a way it's connected to Suzanne's question, that we truly are at a moment where we are all needed, and what you provide here at Conduit is a place where all you need to do is want to be part of the solution, and you are welcome. And we need to have these kinds of conversations, and frankly, Suzanne, difficult conversations. I wish I had more courage earlier on to have the difficult conversations. When you try to raise money, sometimes you aren't as courageous as you should have been. When you get old, then that changes, which is good. And but you provide that space, and relationship matters. And if you keep showing up, you build the trust that allows you then to do things you couldn't have done prior. So thank you, Paul, for the work you do.
And thank you, everybody in the room, for being here.
Thank you, everyone.